But first, after years of drought, the future of the Murray-Darling Basin is being debated after record rains across much of eastern Australia. And there are signs that could make a difference to whatever plan is finally put forward for the future of irrigation in the basin. For one thing, with so much water about, fewer farmers might feel the need to sell their permanent water entitlements to the federal government. And if they do, at what price? Chris Clark reports.
The Gunbower Forest on the Victorian side of the Murray River is an internationally recognised wetland, which until recently hadn't been properly wet for nearly a decade. It's just under 20,000 hectares of river red gum, open forest and woodland. Solid winter and spring rains have produced good flows down the Murray River and its Victorian tributaries.
What we saw is all of those large rivers in the northeast contribute huge flows to the Murray system, and as a result of that, water levels in terms of flows at Turrumbry Weir peaked at about 50,000 megalitres per day.
So this water is actually an overbank flow from the Murray River itself?
Correct. We got overbank flows, and we think there's probably something like about 5,000 or 6,000 hectares of the forest underwater.
So when was the last time that happened?
In 2000. So it's been 10 long years for the forest waiting for a drink.
Damien Wells is CEO of the North Central Catchment Management Authority, whose job it is to manage, monitor and maintain river health in this part of Victoria.
Oh, there's no doubt that nothing beats an over-the-bank flood in terms of the overall ecological response, because it links up with all the other natural cues, and the connectivity between the stream and the floodplain is a very important relationship. However, what we really need to be mindful of is that the flooding frequency of those overbank flows is more or less halved under river regulation.
About 50 kilometres from the Gunbower Forest, Brendan Martin is enjoying the wet season too.
Oh, the last 6 months they've been extremely good. They've been wet. We've had more rain than we've had for probably the last 10 years.
It's a huge reversal from the beginning of the year, when Brendan Martin was on Landline talking about how drought had forced him to change the way the farm was managed.
It means we've had to buy in a lot more feed because we haven't had the ability to grow it, and that also means we're at the whim of the market as far as feed price. We've lost control of our feed base pretty much.
In less than 12 months, with wet weather and irrigation, the reality today represents a turnaround of 180 degrees. Brendan, obviously with water around, you've been able to grow a lot of feed this year too.
Yeah, we have. We've made the most of our spring rain by having a start in the autumn with irrigation. Water got to a price where we could put it on the autumn, and you know, we've grown a lot of feed.
How much have you got here?
There's about 1,000 dry tonne here.
Enough for how long if there wasn't another blade of grass on the place?
Oh, about 12 months.
After years of drought, there's no doubt that having water back in the Murray-Darling Basin has made farming easier. But it hasn't made the politics of water reform any less contentious.
A lot of the anger and initial frustration with where we're headed is basically said, oh, we need water, where's the easiest place to get it? This is the way it looked from our side of the fence. We'll take it from the irrigators.
I have not come here to talk at you. That's not the reason I'm here. And my objective here today is, you know, I get lots of opportunities to talk. I want to spend today getting down as much as possible your views.
The Federal Water Minister, Tony Burke's come to Renmark, the heart of South Australia's riverland.
From this area, I don't think you're going to have an argument that there doesn't need to be river reform. I think it's just how it's conducted.
Some of it will be done through buyback, but we will only buy from people who've put their water on the market. And as much as possible, you want to find ways to be able to get there through infrastructure improvements. When you can do that, whether it's infrastructure on farm, centralised irrigation, or being smarter about how we manage our environmental assets, those are the situations where you can deliver the environmental health of the river system without actually having a hit on productivity.
We had 100 mil of water of rainfall here last week, and that was captured in these bays.
John Bonetti's been farming near Griffith in the Riverina for 50 years, and he won't be selling any of his water to the federal government. The green shoots of his latest rice crop are just emerging. He believes there'll be less water for sale now the drought's broken.
I'm sure that most of the water that was readily for sale would have been brought, and from now on it'll be probably, I don't know about willing sellers, it will probably be forced sellers that will have to sell their water from now on. There'll be still water out there, but I think in less quantities than what it has been in the past.
And John Bonetti won't be putting his hand out for federal government money to make his farm more water efficient. He's already spent $1.5 million drip irrigating his vines and estimates that his water efficiency's improved by about 30%.
So I'm going to argue that we've already contributed. And surely, in the interest of food security, why wouldn't I list to the fact that we can grow the same amount of food with 30% less water? Haven't I already made a contribution?
Mark Hill grows processing tomatoes in northern Victoria. The federal government so far spent only a fraction of the $5.8 billion set aside for upgrading irrigation infrastructure. Part of it is being spent here.
We're laying out a new field for tomatoes. It's subsurface drip irrigation. This all come about by way of the on-farm efficiency grants.
Through the federal government?
Through the federal government, yeah, that's right. So we're doing a 100-hectare field, all subsurface drip irrigation.
Doing 100 hectares of subsurface irrigation for tomatoes will cost upwards of $500,000. Growers get a grant to pay for the works and give up some of their water out of the efficiency saving.
In this particular case, we've given up 100 megalitres of water. We'll probably save over a couple hundred megs. They'll take that. So, to my mind, it's a win-win situation. They're getting water savings, we're getting a more efficient system.
The federal government's been widely criticised for the slow rollout of infrastructure money.
We've got a large amount of infrastructure money available. It's $5.8 billion. And there's been some pressure on me to try to get that money out the door quickly. I've been more cautious than that. While it's a significant amount of money, I want to make sure it is spent very wisely because we get one hit at making sure that we do spend that infrastructure money carefully.
But however the money is finally spent, there are also limits to efficiency savings. This is where Mark Hill's tomatoes end up, Sedenko's processing plant at Echuca.
The most critical thing we need is water. It's the major ingredient for growing tomatoes. Without a good water supply, we basically won't continue to operate.
And it's where you can start to appreciate the knock-on effects if irrigation allocations in this part of the Murray-Darling Basin are cut substantially.
We do about 200,000 tonnes of tomatoes through this plant. We make tomato paste and diced tomato. We supply most of the major manufacturers of retail products in Australia, apart from Heinz, and we have about 40 people full-time and about another 66 people during the season.
These days, nearly all processing tomatoes are grown on drip irrigation.
Currently, we contract 220,000 tonnes this coming season, of which about 90% is grown on subsurface drip irrigation. So there's a little bit more room to improve, but there's not much more we can do from an efficiency point of view.
So here, improving efficiency won't cover irrigation cuts of 30%, as flagged by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. Jason Fritsch runs Sedenko's field operations.
All I can say with certainty is a 30 to 40% cut of water in this valley will have a major impact not only on the processing tomato industry but a lot of other irrigation industries.
Whatever the final level of cuts, clearly the more efficient the system, the smaller those cuts might be.
Right at the moment we're in a situation where there is significant over-allocation. Volume is not the only issue in the health of the basin, but at the moment it is a critical issue.
Do you have any sense at the moment of how much can be saved through efficiencies across the entire basin?
No, I don't, and there are some areas where that question will always vary. It's not just that I don't know the number. I suspect the number as a magic number will never exist, simply because your efficiencies on farm don't only go to your physical infrastructure. They also go to your farming methods. They also go to the varieties of what you've chosen to grow.
While farmers are being asked to do more with less, so too are those in charge of managing environmental assets. The Gunbower Forest is an important bird breeding habitat.
One of the really important objectives in terms of watering the Gunbower Forest is a bird breeding objective, and the probes that we've installed will enable us to monitor water levels. If water levels drop quickly in a flood event, that can actually trigger birds to abandon their nests, and that's something we want to manage against.
So instead of relying on the less frequent overbank flows to flood the Gunbower Forest, there are plans to build a new weir, which will allow a section of the forest to be flooded when flows are much lower. Instead of relying on a big flood in the Murray River to come from that direction, you'll be bringing water from another place.
Correct. This will be a very water efficient way to achieve our ecological goals. With relatively modest River Murray flows, we can run this channel and achieve about a 6,000 hectare inundation in the forest.
Efficient environmental flows could be an important part of the final equation.
My impression is we've only scratched the surface on what might be able to be done in environmental management. There can be some wetlands, for example, which were never used historically to being constantly underwater, and where with engineering methods and pumps you can actually get a situation where you get a much more natural flow without requiring the same levels of volume.
And where that's possible, do you say it goes to the irrigation side of the ledger?
They go to the health of the basin, and therefore that takes some of the pressure off what would otherwise come from irrigators.
The Gunbower Forest is getting a decent drink for the first time in a decade. And if the planned engineering works go ahead, the birds might be nesting here a little more often. Damien Wells from the local catchment authority sees the environmental needs as part of the whole.
What we've got to recognise is that we are living in a regulated system. The important thing is that we have the ecological integrity of the system maintained, and I think that can be done with a mix of those obviously natural events which will occur, but also needs to be very importantly supplemented with structures.
Irrigating forests and irrigating crops. There's only one Murray-Darling Basin, and it must do both.